Okay, welcome to this 10th video in the Buddhism A-level anthology work, the first anthology piece by Armstrong, which is chapter 3 of her book, The Buddha, about the Buddha's enlightenment. Let's read it. Mindfulness also made Gautama highly sensitive to the prevalence of desire, or craving, that is the cause of this suffering. The ego is voracious and continually wants to gobble up other things and people. We almost never see things as they are in themselves, but our vision is coloured by whether we want them or not. How can we get them? How can they bring us profit? Our view of the world is therefore distorted by our greed, and this often leads to ill will, enmity, when our desires clash with the cravings of others. Henceforth, Gautama would usually couple desire, tanha, with hatred, dosa. And when we say I want, we often find ourselves filled with envy, jealousy, rage. If other people block our desires or make us more or succeed where we have failed, such states of mind are unskillful because they make us more selfish than ever. Desire and hatred, its concomitant, are thus the joint cause of much of the misery in the world and evil in the world. On the one hand, desire makes us grab or cling to things that can never give lasting satisfaction. On the other, it makes us constantly discontented with our present circumstances, as Gautama observed the way one craving after another took possession of his mind and heart. He noticed how human beings were ceaselessly yearning to become something else, go somewhere else, and acquire something they do not have. It is as though they were continually seeking a form of rebirth, a new kind of existence. Craving, tanha, manifests itself even in the desire to change our physical position, go into another room, have a snack, or suddenly leave work and go find somebody to talk to. These petty cravings assail us hour by hour, minute by minute, so that we know no rest. We are consumed and distracted by our compulsion to become something different. The world, whose very nature is to change, is constantly determined to become something else. Gautama concluded. It is at the mercy of change. It is only happy when it's caught up in the process of change. But this love of change constantly contains a measure of fear, and this fear itself is dukkha. Right, back to Karen Armstrong and her construction of Buddhism for populist secular man. Question. Here again, Karen Armstrong is talking of the ego, and mindfulness. Mindfulness also made Gautama highly sensitive to the prevalence of desire or craving that is a cause of suffering. The ego is voracious and continually wants to gobble up things and people. So she's again on this journey to market Buddhism, to perhaps especially the American market of society that was influenced more by psychology than sociology, more by Freud and Jung and psychoanalysis than perhaps by sociology and Marxism. And we find here a number of words we're going to pass over this time because we've covered them in some depth already. So these would include mindfulness, prevalence of, and so we've done mindfulness, and we've questioned whether her idea of mindfulness is some generic idea that's not specific to a Buddhist, any Buddhist tradition. The prevalence of desire, and we've looked at tanha. I'm not going to go over that again. Tanha, the different types of tanha, or craving, same idea, desire or craving. That is the cause of this suffering. Well, that's samudaya, the second noble truth, the origin of the cause of suffering, or dukkha. We've gone over dukkha, and so listen to some of the previous videos or go and read up. We want to move on to these ideas here, particularly if we look at this word voracious. and continually wants to gobble up other things and people. But this word voracious, seems to me that Armstrong is making references here that may or may not be appropriate. So what references is she making? Well, perhaps this reference to ego, well, it certainly is a Buddhist reference. Okay, Buddhist teaching. Ego is the illusory state that is generated by attachment, and this attachment is generated by the three poisons, greed, hatred, and ignorance, in which we must fight to develop the three virtues, dana or generosity, love or metta, and greed, hatred, and ignorance, well, wisdom or prajna, wisdom above all, I suppose. However, others think we fight Mara, the mind, and its dualistic way of thinking. It's not the poisons we fight, but the illusion of the dualistic illusion. This is the Mahayana, the claim that everything is empty, sunyata, the voidness, the emptiness of things. So the Buddhist concept of the problem has multiple meanings depending on its doctrinal, traditional context. For Theravada, the ego refers to the not self, the collection of parts, which in a way are together real, the five aggregates. Okay, I have a picture of a heap of twigs collected together, the skandhas, that's where the word comes from. Five aggregates of experience, and the six senses. So, the ego can refer as well to, in the Theravada context, a meditative state of or experience. Whereas emptiness, the self in Mahayana, is in the context of this voidness, this emptiness. All things are empty of intrinsic existence and nature, it says in the Heart Sutra, that little summary. Even the parts are empty. This rejection of Theravada realism. Moreover, in Tibetan Buddhism, emptiness, sunyata, refers to the openness and understanding of non-existence. This sort of two-truth, or better, three-truth doctrine that all statements are false. Everything inter-exists, inter-is. That they take from the Buddha Nature School. The voraciousness here that is referred to of the ego perhaps is Armstrong's Freudian influence, her populist Freudian influence, her psychology, her therapeutic psychology, her psychoanalysis that's influencing her construction of Buddhism. Within Freud and so on, the ego is in the habit of transforming the id's will. Freud reflected on the id's sexual and violent tendencies, which the ego must repress, given social values, and populist thinking collapses the ego and the id together, and she's appealing to this populist Freudian idea of the ego. Certainly not the Mahayana idea of the ego is empty of intrinsic existence. As typically tempted to this dualistic thinking, which causes, or the Theravada idea of the parts, the skandhas. It's a very different idea of the ego and how it's voracious. So let's just move on slightly there. This next phrase that comes up very quickly as we read on. We almost never see things as they are in themselves. Let's highlight that. As they are in themselves. We never see things as they are in themselves. But our vision is coloured by whether we want them or not. So from talk of the ego in Buddhist teaching, as related to the illusory idea of the self generated by attachment, typically in Theravada, from Kant's idea that we're locked into our subjective experience of the world. We get to this Kantian idea of das an sich, or just an sich, things in themselves. This post-Kantian idea that Armstrong has, that she's developing. Our vision is coloured, yes. Kant says we can't know the outside world. It's always an interpretation, a construction, just as Armstrong's view of the Buddha is a construction. And perhaps this is an apt connection to Buddhist teaching on the illusion of self, or anatta. Kant thought man's speculative reason can only know phenomena and can never penetrate to the noumenon. You have the phenomenal and the noumenal. So we can never get beyond the world of our five senses to the noumenon. Certainly Buddhists would want to go further. However, Armstrong's connection of Kant with Buddhism here is kind of breaking down, as Kant argues God was a necessary postulate of reason. Well, that would be an illusion for Buddhists. So she can only go so far with sort of post-Kantian thinking. Man is being not altogether excluded from this noumenal because of practical reason, the capacity to act as a moral agent. And this kind of makes no sense unless there's a noumenal world that is postulated, in which freedom, God, and immortality abide. But to postulate such things would be a delusory and unskillful way of thinking. So we move on from talking about things in themselves, but we'll just pause back and pick up this, go back to this word voracious. Before we go on, there's a lot happening here in this little section here. This word voracious, I'm going to highlight it in blue. There, voracious. Again, it seems Armstrong is drawing from a sort of Western idea, sort of economic perspective, perhaps true of people like Adam Smith, as we've mentioned. Greed is good, the mantra of right-wing economists like Adam Smith. Self-interest and greed is what promotes economic growth. Now, Adam Smith has a sort of general ontological materialism. Does he believe in God or not? Well, it doesn't seem from his philosophy that he does, whether he says he does. But this would contradict Buddhism. Buddhism is not atheistic, it's pantheistic. There's a sense of the divine pervading everything. Didn't Buddhism require a market economy with surplus food to sustain the monastic system? It's very interesting. Certainly the early Sangha and its market-driven nature. There's lots we could say here about this word voracious. But we read on. But our vision is coloured by whether we want them or not. Our vision is coloured. I just want to, by whether we want them or not. Our vision is coloured by whether we want them or not. Buddhists would argue her opposites itself is an illusion. The opposite between the subject and the object. Certainly, the Two Truth doctrine of Mahayana would say this construction itself of Armstrong is an illusion. Now, the background to some of this discussion is about tanha, or desire, and it's as an idea related to Hindu or Brahmin ideas, Aveda, which is an ignorance, and so on. So there's a kind of laziness going on here, and we get this picked up again as we read a bit further down. how we get them, how they bring us profit. Our view of the world is therefore distorted by our greed, and to this it leads to ill will, enmity, whether it clash with the cravings of others. Henceforth, Gautama usually coupled desire with Tana, with hatred, dosa. So desire is greed, desire leads to hatred, and now she goes on to explain that. So this harmonization, is it a little lazy? Is it a little confused? Can you harmonize Adam Smith with Buddhism? So as we said, these sort of oppositions between the self, the ego that wants things, the subject and the object is itself an illusion. One philosopher, Ron Leffer, says in 1997 in the Happiness Project, Tana relates, so desire leads to hatred, avada, and ignorance, moha, because it is based on the mistaken presumption that samsaric dance of opposites is ultimate reality. Harvey helpfully notes perhaps a development in the Buddhist thought from the first discourse of the Buddha, where the Buddha identified desire, Tana, as the principal cause of suffering. However, there's a third discourse, the Fire Sermon, and in that and in other suttas, the Buddha identifies the cause of suffering as the fires of raga, lobha, sort of lust and desire, dosa, devesta, and aversion or ill will, and moha, delusion, confusion, ignorance. The three poisons as we know them only really appear later in the Buddhist thought, in the Fire Sermon, the third sermon of the Buddha, where the Buddha states that nirvana is obtained by extinguishing these fires. Is this development, and it is this development that has confused commentators, especially, it seems, Armstrong here. So what do you think? Is Armstrong confused? Is she not doing enough academic work? Is she glossing over some of the historical critical issues in understanding the life of the Buddha? Tana, another scholar, Walpola Rahula, says, or thirst, desire, greed, craving is what manifests as suffering and rebirth. In what the Buddha taught, Peter, and then Tana Peter Harvey says, is the key origin of dukkha in Buddhism. It reflects the mental state of craving. Greater the craving, the more frustration, because the world is always changing, and innately unsatisfactory craving also brings about pain through conflict and quarrels between individuals, which are all in a state of dukkha. It is such Tana that leads to rebirth and endless samsara, stated the Buddha in the second reality, and is marked by these three types of craving, sensory being non-existence. There are, that's what Harvey's saying, and he goes on, there are right view, wrong views it ultimately traces to Tana, but it asserts the ordinary right view, such as giving and donations to monks, is also a form of clinging. In the end, Tana occurs when the person accepted the transcendent right view through the insight of impermanence and not self or non-self. According to Gethin, Tana is related to aversion and ignorance. Craving leads to aversion, anger, cruelty, violence. Ignorance, states Gethin, which are unpleasant states and cause suffering to the one who craves. So craving is based on misjudgment, states Gethin, that the world is impermanent, unchanging, stable and reliable. So debates around what is Tana from particular important scholars like Harvey, Rahula, Gethin, none of these are mentioned by Armstrong. She carries on without any acknowledgement of the scholarly work in the field, and that's a problem with her writing that we need to acknowledge. She has no talk of these things, dosa, moha, confusion, ignorance. She doesn't mention the fire sermon, and how the Buddha states that it's not until that third sermon that he talks about the three fires, the possible development in the Buddhist thinking, which obviously insider Buddhists wouldn't want to suggest. What do you think? Is there development in the Buddhist thought? So we read on from talk of desire and hatred. When we say I want, we often find ourselves filled with envy, jealousy, rage, if other people block our desires or succeed where we have failed. Such states of mind are unskillful. Let's highlight that. Unskillful. There it is. Unskillful. Because they make us more selfish than ever. Now, we've talked about skillful and unskillful before, so we don't really need to say very much here perhaps about things that are skillful and unskillful. But we just say that these are things that lead to enlightenment if they're skillful, and things that don't lead to enlightenment if they're not skillful. Whereas in Mahayana there's this much more developed idea that what is skillful is upaya. Think the burning house parable, and that skillful means being able to lie if that helps someone, for example. So Armstrong is not getting involved in the nitty-gritty debates. Her aim is to create this homogeneous Buddhism for the secular pluralist man. And in doing so, is she being skillful? Buddhism does seem to be elastic, certainly Mahayana. You can make it up as you go along and construct it whatever way you want to construct it, if it's helpful. And we read on. I want to just get to this very last quote at the end here, right at the bottom. We are consumed and distracted by the compulsion to become something different. The world, whose very nature is change, is constantly determined to become something else. Here she's quoting the Pali Canon again. Gautama concluded, fair enough. And this bit here, but it's not from the canon, it's from her writing. It is at the mercy of change. It is only happy when it's caught in the process of change. But this love of change contains a measure of fear, and fear itself is dukkha. And that's not from the Pali Canon, so she's sort of, it almost sounds like it is, but it's not. This is from her own 2006 book, The Great Transformations, which it seems a paraphrase from Thanissaro Bhikkhu's Pali Canon translation of the Sutta Pitaka book Udana, and 3 verse 10, when it says, he saw living beings burning with the many fevers, aflame with the many fires, born of passion, aversion, and delusion. And this is itself a reference to the third sermon of the Buddha. But it's important to note that she doesn't really tell us where she's getting her stuff from. And she's happy to just quote, but it's not the same, is it? The quote is different. At the mercy of change, it's only happy when he's caught up in the process of change. But this love of change is in a measure of fear. It's a very westernized interpretation of the text for our everyday modern man. Okay, so that's section 10. Well done. Keep going.